Ezra, why did you write a book?
Why did I write a book?
Yeah, this book.
Oh.
And tell us about the book.
Well, first of all, I want to say how appreciative I am that so many people on such an occasion would endure all the risks of getting here to hear me. I'm very honored, and I don't want to try to compete with Fleming. But I do appreciate the opportunity and to be here. And I see it as my job to try to, those of you who want to understand the book, I cannot summarize quickly, but I thought I would just give a few highlights to start the discussion. People ask me if I'm a historian, and I say, no, I'm not a historian. I'm a sociologist who studies contemporary society. But when I finished my book on Dung,
Started with mental health, actually, right?
family and mental health
Right.
was my PhD on American society. But when I finished my book on Dung in 2011, it was just at the time when relations between China and Japan were really bad. And it was just at the worst. They had the boat accident in 2010. And I tried to think what my responsibility was. The reason I wrote about Dung is I felt that my basic job was to try to help Westerners understand what was going in East Asia. And I felt if the most important thing to understand about East Asia at that time for the contemporary field is what what Dung tried to introduce at the third plenum, because I think that trend is the basic trend. So I spent 10 years trying to understand that. And when I finished that, I decided I would try to work on the problem between China and Japan. And I felt, in a way, I was lucky and had a kind of responsibility, because I tried to, I have many Japanese friends. I want Japan to succeed. And I have many Chinese friends. I want China to succeed. So I think people in both countries consider me a friend, and I consider myself a friend of both countries. I want them to get along much better. And I realize a scholar can only do so much. The big decisions are not made by scholars. There may be people with money and people with political power. But what we can do occasionally is try to help people understand. That's all we can do. And I felt that because of my special position, I had written a friend of both sides, and one of my books on Japan became a bestseller. Japan is number one. One of my books on China, Deng Xiaoping, became a bestseller in China. So I felt that I had some potential to have an audience in both countries. Until that time, all the books I wrote, the main purpose was to educate Westerners. But this book, I want to talk to both sides. And I felt that, if a Japanese wrote something, then the Chinese would be a little suspicious as one-sided. If a Chinese wrote it, then the Japanese would feel it's a little one-sided. And I thought, as a friend of both, the Chinese have 旁观者清, so it means a bystander, can sometimes see things clearly. And
旁观者清。
对呀，对呀。So I thought as a bystander, I had some hope of having people on both sides say he tried very hard to present a balanced view. Well, that's the background of how I got into it. And I am not a historian, but when I asked my Chinese friends what needs to be done, they said, well, Japanese don't understand history. They have to face history. So I decided I would study history. So for the last 7 years, I've been reading what I could. And Ronnie exaggerated a little bit. I don't speak any Cantonese. But
He did. He did.
I'm sick on
Hey, better than a lot of you guys.
No. I really don't speak it. But I, somebody who worked hard on both Chinese and Japanese societies, so I decided that I needed to learn about history. And so I spent the last 7 years trying to read the history of the two countries to get kind of an overview of how they came to touch with each other. So I thought what I'd do very briefly today is say something about how I felt China and Japan learned from each other before 79, and then I'll give a very quick view of how I see the periods after 49, so the last 70 years. So one of the things I found as deep interest was how the countries learned from each other. And so I went back to when Japan started learning from China and tried to understand the context of what it was. There was an Empress Suiko who came to power in the year 600. She came to power in 593. But she, at that time, decided that the clan system, which ruled Japan, they had about 30 major clans. They had some clans which were bigger and hers was more powerful, but the nature of the government was kind of the relationship between those clans. They did not have a broader administrative structure, but she had the ambition, and some people with her, Shotoku Taishi, her nephew, had the ambition to try to have a broader administrative structure. You could say a little bit like administrative state organization to go beyond the clan system. And she already had heard enough about China, the Sui dynasty in Chang'an, that she started sending a mission. And the mission first went in the year 600 AD. She already began preparing for that.
That's late Ming. Late Ming.
No.
1600, you said.
No,
600. I'm sorry.
600.
隋朝. Okay.
那个唐还没来. It was just a Sui. So she sent a mission of about 4 ships. And over the next period of time until 838, Japan sent quite a few missions. And they sometimes after one mission, they would leave some monks who were the scholars, the intellectuals of the day, and they would stay and try to learn everything they could. They spent 15, 20 years until the next mission came, and then they came back. So they really learned all aspects and all the basics of Japanese civilization, of a country that moved from a clan system to a state system, was learned from China. First, until that time, Japan had no written language. So they had to learn the characters. And of course, they adapted the characters, and they didn't learn that quickly. Then they tried to also set up an organization. So they had the Taika reforms to try to set up something like an administrative structure. Then they, instead of having the ruler move around from one clan to another, they wanted to have an administrative city that have a modern city layout. So they lay out the city first of Nara, and a few years later Kyoto, exactly like Changsha. They have a north-south grid, and even today, if you go to Kyoto, Ichigo, Nigo, Sango, all the street basic every numbers are laid out exactly as Changsha was in that day. And on the side, I'm sorry, not Changsha. Chang'an. I'm sorry. Lauren Hutu. So sorry about that. Chang'an. So thank you for correcting, Ronnie. So in Chang'an, it was laid out exactly that way. And then they learned how to build big buildings. Until that time, the main Ise shrine, they had to replace every 20 years because the structure, they put the poles in the ground and the wood would rot right away. And they did not have a system. I learned this from a guy named Yukio Lippert, who teaches at Harvard, whose sister is here today. So I learned about this basic learning architectural style from China. And they learned how to make larger buildings. So the old temples of Kyoto, which have a broader structure, it's because they can put the poles in something like cement or rocks so it doesn't rot right away. And they also figured out how to have brackets and to lean the brackets in such a way that you could cover a broader structure. So the architecture that they also learned. And they also learned how to write a history. They from the Chao Dai, the Chinese dynasty history, they wrote the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki. The basics of Japanese history were based on what they learned from China. So in the philosophy, in order to show respect for the leader, they found it would be useful to have Confucianism. So they introduced Confucianist thought. They introduced Buddhism. Although Buddhism, of course, originally came from India, they learned it from China and thought of China as the home place where Buddhist temples that they revered. And so the basics of Japanese culture, in short, came from China. And just as a lot of European countries, the Roman, Greek background, still, or in Christianity, still underlay a lot of European culture. So in the same way, Japanese and Chinese culture, even though they've adapted over the years, they still grew a lot. So the amazing thing to me is, although they sent almost 20 missions over a period of a little over 200 years, the number of people involved was very tiny. But because it was so central to the formation of the Japanese state and so central to the culture they built, it still had a tremendous impact. Okay, I'm going to jump now down the centuries and go up to 1895, when China was learning a lot from Japan, and try to give the background of that period. My quick analysis, if I had to say one thing that gave Japan an advantage in the War of 1894-95, the Sino-Japanese War, is that Japan had been studying a lot about China. So they knew the geography, they knew the location, they knew the technology, and China had absolutely no interest in Japan. There's a little bunch of savage islands out there, and who pays attention to that? And in 1877, the two countries, following the European, Western European system, developed state relations and had their first formal relations. And one of the guys who went to Tokyo in the Chinese mission spent quite a bit of time trying to study Japan. Huang Yunxian was his name. He was the number 2 guy in the mission, and he wrote at that time the best book in Chinese on Japan. But he couldn't even get it published in China. Nobody had interest. And it wasn't until after they lost the war that China finally published that. But they had no interest in Japan. But after the war, I mean, in a way, it's surprising. You fight a country, and then right away you want to send people to that country to study. After World War II, I think so many Chinese were so angry at Japan, I'm not sure they would have gone there to study. But somehow, after the War of 1894-95, it didn't really have the broad populist participation that you had, I think, by the time of World War II, when you had a modern nationalism where people are involved. So the desire to study was very strong, and already the traditional system of preparing for examination was beginning to be in doubt. And by 1905, the system of examinations ended. So if you were a bright young Chinese guy at that time, or you had family who was pretty smart, you want to study modern things. You don't know what way. If you go to Europe, it was too expensive. If you go to Japan, it was much closer. And also because there was a lot of similarity in the language, you could pick up the language quite quickly. And Japan had already translated a lot of the leading books into Japanese, so it was quite easy to learn. So the amazing thing is, to me, how many people from China went to Japan at that time. It was not a government-led. It was not like the way the Japanese had studied China in that early period. It was more individual families sending their kid and allowing them to go. But the amazing thing is the breadth of contact. In 1905, it was estimated there were over 10,000 Chinese studying in Japan. There was no other country in the world that had anywhere near the number of foreign students as Japan had Chinese students. And of course, Sun Yat-sen was there, Kang Youwei, Liang Qichao, they were all there. But in all kinds of fields, you take military, Chiang Kai-shek, studied there. There was another guy that I think deserves much more important attention than he gets is Jiang Baili, who later became head of Baoding Military Academy and had a wonderful strategy that underlay the protracted war that they fought against Japan. But you take not only Chiang Kai-shek, but Zhou Enlai also studied. And you take literature, Lu Xun, Mao Dun, Yu Dafu, Guo Moro. There were just an awful lot of people in the literary field and in various kinds of fields of science and medicine. So nearly every field you can think of, the Chinese in that period were learning, through Japan and through Japanese. And even the words 社会主义, or 共产党, those terms came from Japanese. They were translated. Pardon?
经济 economy.
经济也是. All the terms that they're basically learning modern Western thought through Japan. And so the Japanese translation of those terms into Chinese became, the Chinese. At one time, I was trying to figure out why the Chinese have a term 俱乐部, for club.
俱乐部.
But then I saw the characters written out, and in Japanese it would be read kurabu, So the Japanese had taken the word kurabu and put it in the club into kurabu, and then the characters in the Chinese get a 俱乐部. So many Chinese terms really were introduced through Japan. So I think the basic learning from 1895 to the beginning of World War II, was extraordinary. It was not organized by government. It was not planned the way the Japanese first learned from China, but it had a tremendous impact. So I think that not many people in the West have any idea how much that learning took place and how deep the relationship was. It wasn't smooth because now in the United States, for foreign students, we have all kinds of structure and planning. At that time, they had no structure, no planning, and it was a little disorganized. But there were some Japanese who tried to develop preparatory schools in the language to get them ready for universities and so forth. So even though it was a little messy and not so well organized, not so well planned, still it was massive in its impact. Okay, now I will jump down to the recent period because I think you're more interested in the recent period. And I will talk in the last 70 years since the communists came to power. I'll give you my quick periodization of what happened after World War II between the two countries. First of all, the Americans during World War II, who won World War II in the Pacific? Our view is Americans won it. We bombed in the Pacific Ocean. We bombed all the Japanese cities. And then we used the atomic bomb. And then Japan gave in. That's the American reading of how Japan lost the war. I think for many Chinese, they say China defeated Japan. And
really?
Yeah, and I think there's some truth to that. I can understand that because they wore out the Chinese, and they were they wore out the Japanese, and the Japanese were so overextended in China already after the first 3 or 4 years. They couldn't move much beyond after the battles of Wuhan and Suzhou. They didn't really have the strength to go over the mountains into Sichuan. And so they were really worn out and dragged out from the war. And that, in a way, that wore the Japanese out. So, although I'm an American, and on that particular question, I look at the American way of interpreting it, and I think yes. But I think it's also true that the Chinese wore out Japan, and they were so overextended. And if that hadn't happened, it wouldn't have been easy for the Americans to fight the battles in the Pacific that we won, because the Japanese would have had more forces available. They were so spread out too thin, and that I think that's partly because of the Chinese Pacific. Well, so World War II ends, communists come to power. Now, the first period of relation, if I have a quick, say, 4 period of relations after World War II, the first I would say from 1949 until, say, 1972. And during that period, they did not have formal relations. But actually, Japan wanted to have more relations with China, but the United States didn't want them to, because by the time the Cold War began, and especially after Korea and the war broke out, we didn't want Japan helping out China, because China was working with the Soviet Union, and so that they were our enemy. So we didn't let Japan carry on much trade. There was a very tiny bit of trade, and the politicians who went were certain, mostly members of the Socialist and Communist Party. There were a few people in the Liberal Democratic Party. There was a guy named Utsunomiya, who was a friend of China, but a very tiny number of Japanese and very tiny number of businesses, not really much. Okay, 72, things change. Why? Japan had been wanting to trade with China all along. They felt that they needed for their islands all kinds of imports and all kinds of exchanges. And, until 1971, America had been telling Japan, don't support China joining the United Nations. Don't give them any help. Don't have too much trade. But once we decided to send Kissinger to Beijing in the next year, 1972, we allowed Nixon to go. The Japanese were quite angry at that point, because they felt that we had been encouraging them not to do anything with China, and suddenly, without telling Japan, we take the lead. So Japan wants to move very quickly. They're afraid America is going to corner the China market, and they wanted to move very quickly. So within 6 months, they had a new prime minister who wanted to have a relation with China, Tanaka Kakue, and they normalized relations right away. The United States waited a few years. There are all kinds of details, but the Japanese jumped in. So between 1973 and 75, already lots of Japanese, all different groups, began going to China. In 73, Zhou Enlai became very sick with cancer, and so he had an understudy, Deng Xiaoping. So the guy who met a lot of the Japanese groups of all kinds was Deng Xiaoping. And I counted one time over 40 different groups of Japanese that he met, for all the main political parties, local regions, business, Buddhism, all kinds of specialists that Zhou Enlai met. So by 1978, when Deng Xiaoping was about to come to power, he allowed China and Japan to sign a treaty, a peace treaty, that really enabled them to move ahead with relationships on a much broader scale. And then in 1978, in October, he went to Japan to visit. And in that trip, he could go traveling around and say, oh, my old friend from, because so many Japanese groups from all parts of Japan had already met him. So the Chinese quickly said, 老朋友, because he had seen them before. So the people from Japan at that time who wanted to move ahead with relationships, they realized that to break into the Chinese market, they had to be somewhat helpful, because they did such terrible things in World War II. Chiang Kai-shek had not required that they pay reparations, but they realized that to break into the market, they needed to be somewhat generous in teaching China, and so they were ready to help out. And Deng Xiaoping in Japan, in October 78, he rode on the Shinkansen. At that time, as you know, China had no modern railway. Now, about half the modern railway of the world, the Gaotie, the fast trains, are in China. But at that time, they had zero. So the first time a Chinese leader rode on the fast train was under when Deng rode from Tokyo to Kyoto on the fast train.
I thought that Deng Xiaoping was only came back up in November of 1978. So he was there already
December.
a month before. December, okay.
He became, the third plenum was December 78. But he visited Southeast Asia and Japan before that. So I think if you try to interpret what was going on, already he had some idea that he was going to play an important role. And because he knew about foreign policy, Hua Guofeng, who was the designated successor, did not. And so he was allowed to go help with foreign countries. But I think he also had some idea that he might be playing a bigger role after the third plenum. So this, in a way, was, and when he came back in 77, he realized education was very important. So he took over the education responsibility and the higher examination. He started in late 77. So I think he was already thinking about what China needed in order to modernize and move ahead. And education to revive the universities and have entrance examinations was absolutely necessary. And he felt that a lot of technology could come from Japan. So he visited 3 factories at that time. One is New Japan Steel at Kimitsu, which is one of the, right across Tokyo Bay, one of the most modern steel plants in the world. And that was the model for Baoshan. So the first great steel plant that was introduced in China was studied from Kimitsu, from the New Japan Steel. Then he also visited a Nissan. And Nissan, I think, is especially interesting because when Japan was occupied Manchuria, they started the Japanese industry, Ruchan. In Chinese, it would be Ruchan, Nissan. So the industries that were in Manchuria, they weren't yet producing automobiles, but after the war, they started producing automobiles. So he visited that factory, and that they had just introduced robots. It was kind of a new thing. And Deng asked them, if you did a calculation, how many cars per worker did they produce a year? They said, well, maybe somewhere between 93, 95. He said, in China's about 1. So that's what a modern factory. I mean, in those days, in China, to produce a car was almost like a handicraft industry, where you put it together. So it's the difference between a modern industrial plant and the old handicraft industry. So he visited that. Then he went down to Osaka, and he met Matsushika Konosuke, and who Panasonic or National. In those times, of course, was not yet computers or an internet, but they were introducing television and modern electronic calculators and such things. And so he wanted, and Matsushita had spent some years in China before, had a special interest, and he had a vision of selling television sets all over China. And so Deng Xiaoping called him the god of industry, modern industry. So that laid the basis for the kind of industrial development that China then later had. Okay, now so that's the first period from 78 up to about 93. Now I started a second, this is my periodization. Why do I say 93? Because after the June 4th incident at Tiananmen Square, Deng worried that the youth were not very patriotic, and he wanted to set up patriotic education. Until that time, I think the Communist Party before 1978 was a class struggle, and they unified people through the working class or the peasant class against the capitalists and against the landlords. But by the time he wanted to open markets, you could no longer call all of them capitalists and get a class warfare if you want to develop modern enterprise. So he felt we had to rely on nationalism to unify the country. So after the June 4th demonstration, he tried to teach nationalism. And once that movement started, some of the most successful way of building nationalism was to remind them how they suffered during World War II when the Japanese invaded and some of the horrible things that the Japanese did during World War II. And I remember going to Beijing in the years following that, and it was not difficult to turn on the television set to find a movie about World War II and the devils from Japan doing all kinds of bad things. So it was quite widespread, the use of modern technology, modern communication to build up a strong patriotic anti-Japanese feeling. So that began in about 93. But the reason I use that time period is because I think by that time, Japan resumed very rapid growth. After Tiananmen from 89 to 93, the growth rate had slowed way down. But in 93, some people estimated maybe 13% a year growth. And they could see that that was going to continue.
China.
And I'm sorry, I'm an old man that keeps following up. Thank you for reminding me. So they were beginning to grow China was beginning to grow very rapidly. So after in 93, they grew about 13% a year, and they could see that within a finite number of years, they would probably surpass Japan. And I think 2008 I would say, is an important year in that process, because with the successful Beijing Olympics and with the financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis in the West, Chinese confidence was quite high, and they could feel that they were beginning to pass Japan. In 2010, there was a big, the World Bank announced that the Chinese economy size passed Japan's. And there was also a big shipping clash that year. And 2 years later, when the so-called nationalization of the Diaoyudao, the Senkaku Islands, there were very serious incidents, and that's the time when I could feel the relationship between China and Japan was so bad that I wanted to do what little I could to try to help mutual understanding to get over that period. But the reason I use that periodization is from 93 until about 2014, I would say is the year when China began to see that they could pass Japan, and they passed Japan. So another way of putting it is that from beginning of contact in 600 until 1895, China was in the top. But after 1895, until this period of from about 93 when to 2012, when China was passing Japan, Japan was in the driver's seat. So even in the 80s, when the relations were relatively friendly and Japan was helping China, still it was the Japanese guy in the big business suit, who was confident, and the Chinese were students and they were poor. And so the Japanese were in the driver's seat in a way in that relationship. But I think with some of the incidents that happened in 2010, 2012, were in the context of China beginning to pass Japan and feeling very confident they could stick it to the Japanese and say, now it's your turn to bow down to us. And I think by the year 2012, 2014, that transition had taken place. And the two countries had to readjust to a very new relationship. In the 1880s, Fukuzawa Yukichi, leading thinker in Japan, said we no longer look to China to learn. We should get out of Asia and look to the West to learn from them. But by 2012, the Chinese were already confident that they had, not only in other things, but in technology, they'd begun to catch up. And so that they know, so that period of when the Japanese were on top from 1895 to about 2012 or so was over. Then I would say the new period, 2014, is when the two countries have tried to stabilize relationships since that time. And even though they're not quite friendly, I think the risk of conflict that was quite high around 2010, 2012, the emotions were running absolutely at top peak. I think that now in the last few years, there is some stability. So I think next year Xi Jinping visits Japan in the cherry blossom season, as he has announced. The first time in 12 years, the top leader from China to go to Japan. I would expect the relations to be even more stabilized. I don't expect that they would be great buddies or they would be allies, but I do expect that they could go from really bad political relationship to more working relationship where the hostility is lessened somewhat. So my hope is that the leaders of the two countries will use this opportunity to develop better relationships. And it may be a little bit of a dream to a scholar to hope that his own work could be useful, but in my megalomaniac times, I would like to think that my book could be useful for those in the two sides who want to try to have better relationships with each other. Thank you very much, Ronnie.
Do you think that the United States is a factor in the better relationship between China and Japan today?
My hunch is that it helps China decide to work with Japan because, if I were a leader in China and trying to stir up patriotism and in 20 years ago or the 90s, Japan was very useful. But now the relations between China and Japan, between the United States and China, are so tense that if you're trying to stir up patriotism, you don't have to say Japan. You can say United States. So I think that's one way it had something to do with it. And I think from the Chinese point of view, that if they don't get, they would like to have foreign investment continued. And if the Americans now, because of tension, sort of decreased foreign direct investment, I think it's quite possible that Japan might. So some of my Japanese friends who live in Beijing say they see a lot of companies now, and they see it coming to Beijing. And they have the feeling there's a certain receptivity of Japanese companies. So the next spring when Xi Jinping visits Japan, they might be able to announce quite a new increase in foreign direct investment. So I think that would, if I were Xi Jinping, I would think that would be a good thing. And so I think in those ways, the American role may have had some impact in sort of helping push forward the better relations between Japan and China.
Ezra, comment on the following incident. It is an actual incident that happened to a friend of mine. Last year, I was in Guadalajara about 13 months ago, and I bumped into a Swiss friend. And this gentleman has been working in Japan for many, many years. He didn't live there, but he has been running a very high power, closed door discussion group in Japan for the last 15 years. He invited me all those 15 years. I just never had the time to go. And he said this publicly. He said, this is last year, 13 months ago. He said, if 3 years previously I had suggested for the Japanese friends to study if America is a trustworthy partner, they would probably commit me to a mental institution. But last year, the Japanese initiated that topic and said, let's discuss Is America a trustworthy partner? I think Japan is not the only one that is asking that question. I think Germany is asking that question. France is asking that question. Italy is asking that question. Many around the world are asking the same question. Is America a trustworthy partner? So could it be that um, because of the way America has been behaving, especially since Trump, but even before Trump, that Japan may realize, like many other countries, that if America is no longer the most trustworthy partner, that you have no choice. Geography seems to dictate that you have a better relationship with your neighbor. Personally, I believe that America will still be Japan's best friend militarily. But what about economically and many other fields? So you think that there is any merit to what I've just described?
Yes, I do. I think the job of a scholar. I consider myself an American patriot, but I believe a scholar should be honest and tell it like it is. And I think that the fact that we have put so much money into Middle Eastern military affairs, and that now there's a reaction. I don't think it's only Trump. I think Trump has, in a way, exaggerated the
Correct.
trend you're describing. But I think if I were a Japanese taking a tough look over the next 10 years and saw Americans spending so heavily in the Middle East and wondering whether they can keep it up and whether they're going to have such investment in the Western Pacific, I think they have good reason to question, and especially after some of the narrow patriotism of Trump, withdrawing from TPP and taking such a negative reaction toward international organizations. And needs to say, I think there are many of us Americans who hope that the next American administration would reverse the trend. But you don't regain trust and confidence that quickly. Even if we are able to adopt policies that many of us think we ought to waste less money on military in the Middle East and take a more active, encouraging role to international organizations. I think that the question you raise will linger, and I think there's no way we can avoid that.
Well, allow me to ask one more question on the United States because it's just so important, huh? Both to China and to Japan, indeed to everybody, anybody in the world. That America has a history of isolationism. It was founded in isolationism. 1823, you have the Monroe Doctrine, you have the exceptionalism. They never joined the League of Nations. They retreated to itself after World War One, and then it was only forced upon it after the World War II to take on more responsibility in the international arena. So, if America were to go back to isolationism, as you did describe, pulling out of many organizations within the World Bank World Bank Group and many other organizations, including TPP and so forth, then what's new? America has a history of isolationism. 1903, 1902, there was the Roosevelt corollary. All those things tells me that America, one should not be surprised.
Well, all countries have complicated and different tendencies. The way I would say is after World War One, there were some people in America, like our president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, who wanted to take a much more international role. So it's not that every bone in our body was isolation. I think there were struggles. And the
Just
part,
80%.
I think the part of my generation, I really think there was a sea change in my generation because I was 15 when the war was over, World War II, and the leaders of our country then realized that if America were to enjoy peace, we could not, two world wars that we could not stay out of. We didn't want to get involved in World War I. We didn't want to get involved in World War, but I think we learned the lesson from that time that we had to take part in international organizations. And so we believed at that time that why did Germany go back to World War is because we were too tough on Germany after World War One, and for our own good, we had to create world organizations that had some structure of peace, and we had to set up a structure of World Bank and other institutions. Uh, Maybe my generation was stronger on that than some of the later ones, but I don't think that has completely gone. I think there are plenty of people in America who still believe that number one. And number two, I think we're so much more involved than we were in our isolationist history. I think the structure of our business activity, the structure of international trade, communication, transport, we're so fundamentally involved that the idea of decoupling is impossible. Even though Trump may advocate it, and some people want, there's no way we can go very far. We can create a mess and make it much more complicated, but we can't stop it. I think the world is just too linked by transport and communication to have that kind of isolationism again. So I agree with your analysis about our role historically, but I really do believe that there was a sea change after World War II, and that though there are people now who say we overextended ourselves after we were too generous, and now we don't have the resources to be so generous. Other countries should play a bigger role, and I think that view is deep, and I agree with that. But I think it's still quite different from the isolationism you described before World War II.
But whatever it is, I think it's good, isn't it, that Shinzo Abe seems to be throwing out a olive branch, and Xi Jinping seems to be throwing his olive branch just in the last year or two. That perhaps are we at the brink of perhaps a possible a period of better relationship for whatever reason, U.S. or without U.S.
I think that for a country to really make a basic change, you require a certain kind of stability of your government. And I think part of the reason that Japan relation with China was so bad over this 2010-12 period is governments were changing so often. Every year you had a new government, and it was hard to have a consistent policy, and it was hard for other countries to make agreements with a country that's changing so much. And I think Abe supplied two things. One, he provided continuity so you could deal with them. And the second, I think it was analogous to what Nixon did in opening with China.
Right.
I think if we'd had a liberal Democrat who was in the White House at that time, if Gene McCarthy had been the president at that time, I think we would have had a divided country that would be an absolute mess. But when you got Nixon, who was strongly anti-communist, take that step, he could get away with it. I think, Abe, by going to Yasukuni Shrine before he was prime minister, he showed that he had the patriotic instincts that could pull the Japanese. So if they started becoming closer to China, he had I think Hatayama before him, who wanted to fly quickly to Beijing and be friendly, he didn't have that kind of base. He couldn't have done it, even if he'd been in power for several years. But I think Abe had, as I say, two things. He had the continuity in the organization, and I think he had shown his people that he was sufficiently patriotic. They could trust him to make more movements to China.
And the fact that his family history may also enforce that side of things.
Well, as you know, by saying that Kishi, his grandfather was quite a conservative person, and he had very good relations as a child with his grandfather Kishi and liked him very much. But I think that Abe also proved that he could be quite pragmatic, and I think we're lucky. If he had been too much of a right winger and not pragmatic, he couldn't have made that change and couldn't have had better relation with China. But I think he had the right combination of longer term, he had the solid base of support, and yet he was willing to be pragmatic and stop going to Yasukuni Shrine. I think it's the same thing that Nakasone before him, that Nakasone had visited Yasukuni Shrine. Once he got that reaction from China, that they made that such an important issue as to indicate that if they had trouble, they would, really have a bad relationship. Once they focused on that issue, the pragmatic Japanese decided he shouldn't go to Yasukuni anymore.
Of course, it is not just China that opposes Korea as well. But whatever it is, doesn't matter. Let's go back to the issue of what can we do today, besides writing books, for all of us, business people, what have you. What can we do to better China-Japan relations?
What can business people
Or anybody? Just look at the overall picture of China-Japan relations. What needs to be done
Well, I
in order
think,
to
of
put in
course,
the right
the
path?
real power, of course, is in the political leaders and the people around them. They can do much more than we can do. So I think they need to go step by step in a pragmatic way in areas of common interest to begin to work together. They shouldn't rush. They should go, in my view, step by step. I think in this strange era, when there's such bad relations, and I'll start with the United States and China. I think that now the relationships are really pretty bad. That all of us who are in between, whether in business, academic, whatever kind of, those of us who have relations on both sides have to do everything we can to keep those relations and keep them alive and keep communication going. And at this time, when I think our government in the United States is so tough on China and ready, I agree that we must protect American interests, but that's one thing to protect American interests, and the other is to be so nasty that you're going to antagonize the other side so much. So I think we have to find a way to do all we can to keep up the contacts. I think we should not be too provocative in our own countries. I mean, some people in the United States may consider me a panda hugger because I want to be friendlier. There are 5 of us who wrote that letter to the Washington
Who
Post.
started that letter? Many
Well,
more signed, right? Wasn't it?
No,
Was it the
well,
same?
yeah, once we could people wrote in the Foreign Affairs, they say engagement didn't work. A lot of us felt that was not correct. I mean, it was just wrong. I think Fred Hu understands that and has made very interesting talks on that topic too. And Bob Zellick, a lot of us knew that was absolutely wrong. But we were not organized at that time, so we didn't know quite what to do. So a whole bunch of us started writing back and forth. And then finally, the 5 of us who did it, we represented a couple of us academics, Taylor Pravel and myself. There were a couple former government employees, Tape and Susan, and Mike, not Susan Shirk.
Susan.
Yeah. Susan Thornton, thank you.
Okay.
Susan Thornton
Good
and Mike
lady.
Swain. So
Yeah.
Mike Swain's a think tank in Washington. So we did it, and then we didn't want everybody to sign. We wanted it to be a very select group. So we could have gotten a lot more signatures, but we wanted to get people who were prominent, who had credibility and active. My friend Joe Nye, I got to sign. Walter Mondale, former vice president, signed. So we got a very consistent, good group. I think after we wrote that letter, it was impossible to say there was a Washington consensus that engagement failed because we had enough prominent people who said, look, it's more complicated, we got to work. And I think the mood has shifted a little in Washington. Even Pence recent talk and Pompeo's recent talk, they say we want a prosperous China, we must work with China. They're beginning to use those terms, even though their speech is still strongly tough, anti-Chinese mood. But I think they've moved a little because I think our group helped change the mood a bit.
I think there was another letter that was signed by 179, if my number is correct. And I think State Roy and so forth has a hand to start with that. You also signed that one?
I don't know which one,
179.
179. I don't
You
know.
don't know
But
about.
there was a group of a lot of former military people who thought we were wrong, who signed a letter, but I don't remember 179. But I do, as far as I know, representing our point of view, that was the main group, the five of us, and then the larger group.
Let me ask you a question, since we have a gentleman from the Japanese business community here. Do you think the Japanese business community feel comfortable enough at this stage to enlarge investment in the mainland of China?
I think that. Well, I give you my opinion. Maybe he can give you the real story. But
By the way,
let me start with my opinion. Then
please,
he
please,
can correct me.
please.
I think the Japanese are pragmatic enough to feel that there are a lot of opportunities, and there are a lot of Japanese businesses have been here a long time, that they're even prepared to go 2 or 3 years. Where if they have a factory here, if they run into trouble, they can have a few more parts made in Vietnam or uh, India or someplace. But they still think the Chinese market is so large that they want to be here. So I think that the other thing is you have trading companies in Japan, which are really quite remarkable institutions, which we Americans don't have. And they, were set
Nobody
up.
else have.
Well, they were setting up in the 19th century so that a lot of small Japanese companies that wanted to go and trade abroad would have some base to build on. And so in the China market, you take Itochu or Mitsubishi or Mitsui that have maybe 10 offices or so in all the major cities. And they have a regular staff who not only are ready to work and cooperate with a variety of businesses, but who know the local leaders and who have deep roots. Some of them even know local dialects. So that I think that even though there are certain Japanese firms that may not be able to adapt to a changing situation, there will be other Japanese firms that will. So I think for a trading company to keep roots in China is quite easy and sensible. So I think from a trading company's point of view, there's no question you can stay. But individual Japanese companies, you have to see what's the market. And for example, certain kind of industrial goods now, they don't produce there. But a lot of service sector growth, I think, is taking place already, and it'll probably continue. Now, maybe a Japanese businessman.
We have the Japanese
correct.
Consul General here. You're welcome to raise your hand, and I'll give you the microphone. And we have the gentleman from Hasegawa-san from Sumitomo Mitsui Trust. He is also welcome to comment. Okay, but anyway, but the Japanese tend to move in groups. If they just go all by themselves, they don't seem to feel comfortable, and perhaps rightly so. It's rather lonely to be a Japanese company somewhere in China. So, is it possible that a group of Japanese companies, perhaps encouraged by China leader and Japanese leaders, would move together in a more unison way?
I think that after 2010 and 12, the Japanese are much more cautious. The last several years, if you look at public opinion polls in China, the attitude toward Japan has improved somewhat. From a period several years ago when almost 90% of Chinese had a bad image, now it's gone down to maybe 60, 70. But in Japan, yet it hasn't yet moved. And I think having your stores, object of targets, and seeing the ships and airplanes moving on the Diaoyu Senkaku area has a very big impact. So I think the Japanese are more concerned and more worried, and they're more cautious. So my hope is that after Xi Jinping's visit next year, that there'll be some increase in receptivity in Japan and somewhat more confidence about operating in China. But I think the general mood is one of the market is so big, we got to be there in a lot of areas, but we better be cautious. And for a while, the term in Japan was China plus one. That meant they would go in China, but they would have another factory someplace else. So if they ran into problems, they do produce in other countries. So I think that mood of sort of deep concern has not disappeared, even though relationships are a little better.
You mentioned about the Diaoyu Island of what, 2012? Why did Japan make that decision at that time? It really seems to be throwing oil on fire.
Well, first of all, from the Japanese point of view, it was not really nationalization. It was not the sovereignty issue. And I think some of the Chinese bureaucrats understood that. It was not really a sovereignty issue. And I
Then what
think,
issue was it? Then what kind of issue was that?
well, Noda at that time was prime minister. He was not a highly experienced person, and he had a lot of turmoil in his own party he was busy with. So I don't think he fully understand it. And when the Chinese said they were very concerned about that, he was worried that Governor Ishikawa, who was governor of Tokyo at that time, who was a real white right winger,
Oh yes, I met
and
him.
I know him,
Oh,
and
scared the heck out of me.
he wrote a book called Japan Can Say No. That was first to the United States, and then to China. He also felt the same way. So he was about to buy those islands from the Japanese owner, and the Prime Minister Noda, the Socialist Party, was worried that that would be even more inflammatory, and he thought he didn't have the base of a discussion and the knowledge and the support and the consistency around him to know better. So when he was told by the Chinese not to do that, he felt that it still had to be done to avoid the Ishikawa. And so I think it was that complex situation of worry that more right wingers would cause even more trouble. And he thought he could handle the issue somewhat better. And from the Japanese point of view, it really wasn't nationalization. It's just who owned that property. And there were some Japanese who knew things very well were under surprise that the Chinese would understand the property owning as a sovereignty issue, because it really had nothing to do with sovereignty, the purchase of that property. But Chinese called it nationalization, so they interpreted it as a sovereignty issue and became very upset.
Well, I don't want to go on that. But anyway, one last question, then I open to the floor. You say that Chinese sentiment about Japan has improved a little bit, but China also has another thing working for her is the government can really move the societal sentiment a lot easier, perhaps, than the Japanese. Am I correct on that? That if Xi Jinping and his team were to think that it's time to have better China-Japan relations, he probably can do it. In Japan, what needs to be done in order to move the Japanese sentiment toward China, which has not moved that much? You just said.
Well, in World War II, Japan had a propaganda department, and they could control. There wasn't contact with the outside. And China has now a propaganda department, and they can manage media quite well and quite effectively, as you say. In Japan, I think now what goes on in NHK has a big impact. So it's not decided by the government to carry something. And I think the images of what goes on in China make a big difference. So when a Chinese buzz Jiaoyudiao, Senkaku, I think if the Chinese really wanted to improve relations, there are a number of things they could do that would have quite a big impact. They could stop buzzing Jiaoyudiao Senkaku so often. They could buy agricultural products from most of the 10 prefectures from which they're not buying. After the Fukushima incident, the Chinese decided not to buy from a whole bunch of prefectures. But the Japanese say, well, the whole lot of those prefectures had nothing to do with it. It's just agricultural protectionism. So I think if the Chinese would move on that, and those kind of things got reported in the Japanese press and on TV, that would have probably more impact than anything that a Japanese leader could say to change the opinion.
Well, the Japanese Consul General is welcome to comment on any of these things. Would you like to, Consul General, make some comments before we open to the floor? Yes? The microphone, please.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Vogel. Very comprehensive lecture on Japan-China relations. And as a China expert in the Japanese Foreign Service, I really hope that Japan-China relation can become better in the coming years. But as you have already talked about a little bit, Japanese people's feeling towards China is still very bad. And I think this is really can be a hurdle for the two countries to change the situations. And from Japanese ordinary people's point of view, I think the before '89 Tiananmen incident, I think many Japanese people like China and they really want to make good friends with China and Chinese people. But after the Tiananmen, we changed our perception about China. And then, as Dr. Vogel mentioned, China also started domestic education to youth, the nationalism education. It can be said kind of anti-Japan education. And Japanese people really simple. If people likes me, I also likes you. But if you hate me, I also hate you.
That's true of
very
everyone,
simple,
isn't it?
simple sentiment. And so, well, Hong Kong situation is also have some impact on
Oh, no.
relations. Hong Kong people loves Japan, and so we love Hong Kong. We love Hong Kong people, but now they are fighting. Well, I don't know, but they feel uncomfortable or unhappy with mainland, and mainland people also criticize Hong Kong. You are lacking a nationalist education, 爱国主义, and those kind of things can. Anyway, I don't want to see the situation where China will continue to stress the importance of 爱国主义 nationalism, and Communist Party always remind people, don't forget about Japan's invasion during the World War II, how they are, so those kind of things could be a very difficult issue for Japan-China relations. I want to know your views on this.
The speaker is right next to me today, so any response?
No, I don't find anything to disagree with.
Okay, why don't we open to the floor? We do want to close by perhaps 9:20, 9:25, because the subway may close at 10 o'clock. I want to make sure that everybody get out. Otherwise, we could stay here till 10 o'clock. But anyway, any questions from the floor? Yes, sir.
Yeah, first off, thank you very much. I appreciate hearing your view. I want to go back to two things you mentioned. First off, you mentioned something early on, which is in order to unite the country, there was an effort to demonize the Japanese. And depending on the time frame, sometimes they were friends and sometimes it was an advantage to demonize them. So the question I have is given that they need that for a nationalist card, the Chinese need that as a nationalist card, is it something that the leadership can say, you know what, we're okay now with Japan, and Japan's going to be our friend, or does it take away the card that they need possibly in the future to keep the people together, united against, just someone outside? It doesn't have to be a Japanese, but just someone outside. And also, do they lose credibility? Does the Chinese government lose credibility if they say, hey, I know that we've been demonizing them, and let's just look at the most recent case in the 70th anniversary of the Chinese Party, which just occurred. In the lead up, the 2 months in the lead up, the Chinese program had to show a lot of nationalist videos, etc. And a lot of those were the movies that you were referring to. I was there in Beijing, and I'll never forget sitting in the gym and looking at all the TVs, and they're all some type of war film with the Japanese as the enemy. And I get the purpose, but the whole point is, can you reverse that on a whim with the people when that's what the government's been playing for so long?
I think it's not easy for the Japanese to feel at ease because they feel like it come back. So even if relations improve quite a bit next year, I think there are a lot of Japanese who would still be uneasy that within several years, if China has trouble uniting itself, they might begin to reuse that. Another way to think about it is if you were a leader in Beijing and you saw what happened to the Soviet Union falling apart, and you saw what happened in Eastern Europe falling apart, and you know they have 1.4 billion people of many different kinds of nationalities and so many differences and different levels, and that your growth was going to slow down with the next few years. I think if I were a leader in that country, I'd be very worried, very concerned about how you unite the country. How do you keep it united against all those different pressures? What do you use? I'm afraid as an American now, the next few years, there may be the left wing in the leftists in China and the rightists in the United States may have common cause, and they will promote each other's cause. I mean, when the American rightists, yell at China, I think the Chinese leftists, ready to get angry at the United States. So I think that is a real danger, and I think the Japanese are probably right in their estimate that that if things get really difficult in Beijing, there are some people who might again go back to World War II as a way of strengthening national unity.
Any other questions? Right here, second table. Thank you.
I'll be Silas Shu, Harvard 05. I'll be interested in your thoughts, Professor Vogel, about what I sense is kind of a conflict between, let's say, the nation-building project of China. One interpretation of, let's say, why China was relatively weak in modern history is that China came together as a nation quite late. The War of 1895, or even before that, it was fought China as an empire, and it was subjugated by European nation states. So then you could say China became a stronger country because of nationalism, and now I guess Chinese nationalism becomes sort of a hurdle against better relations, not just with Japan, but with many of China's neighbors. So I'll be interested in your thought as to, is there a conflict between sort of China coming together as a stronger country and the need for nationalism as a part of that, and how that might conflict with relations, not just with Japan, but with countries around China as well?
The way I think about it now that I've been studying a little bit of history is that in the 19th century, by the 19th century, the Chinese imperial system was not adapted to respond to the challenge from the West. And they needed some kind of system which could provide a tighter, stronger leadership to the country. And that after the 1911 revolution, it took many decades to find a system that could pull together such a complicated country. And it was really the domestic war of 45 to 49 that the communists were able to really unite the country and begin to develop a new kind of national system that would lead a country in the modern age. And I think after 1978, they made extraordinary progress in sort of building up a strong, centralized country. But the problems in China are so severe and particularly when growth slows and you have so many different ethnic groups. I think if I were a Chinese leader, I'd be very worried as to how you're going to hold that country together. When, even in Spain, you have trouble with Catalonia, and France, you have trouble, in Canada, you have trouble with French Canadians, and the European community have trouble with Brexit. And now China has so much more people than all those places put together to manage by
A little
far.
problem in Hong Kong.
Pardon?
A little problem in Hong Kong.
And a problem in Hong Kong. So I think holding the large country of China together is I think the rest of the world ought to be happy that somehow they figure out a way to do it, as long as it doesn't encroach on too many other countries. It's an extraordinarily complicated job to keep that many people. And frankly, I think there are difficulties in the system. I think that now the effort to control information is not going to be able to stand for a long time. When you have 1.5 million people studying abroad every year and 100 million tourists going abroad every year, 350,000 students in the United States, how can you have tight control over information? I think it's I can't understand how they could hope to sustain the control over information when in this kind of international period of travel, so many people can go abroad. So I think the current effort to control information, I don't see how they can sustain that very long.
Any other? Right here in front. By the way, Kitamura-san, former Consul General of Japan in Hong Kong, perfect example, local Chinese wife. So it's a perfect between China and Japan. So you're welcome also to comment. Sir.
Thank you, Professor Vogel. One of the apocryphals we always heard when we grew up in the PRC is that Chairman Mao actually declined Tanaka's offer for war reparation on the ground that it was actually the Imperial Japanese Army that actually gave the Communist Army a respite, which actually led to its eventual triumph. And regardless of the veracity of this particular story, one just cannot underestimate the extent to which Japan was actually a defining factor for the formation of modern China. While this particular influence is a bit declining, at least China shouldn't be as obsessive with Japan as before. Do you think this is actually a valid reason for China to gradually wean itself off from this more virulent version of nationalism, which is really good for no one?
And is Japan declining?
No, the influence, not Japan declining, because the influence on China from Japan, because of China's comparative rise, so there is actually perceptively a declining influence. Japan can no longer be the determinant factor for the formation or the progress of China like it once was maybe about 100 years ago. So
Thank
that's
you
my
for the
question.
clarification.
I think that when Mao said after World War II, that we have to thank the Japanese for helping to unite China, there probably was very considerable truth to that. What I'm afraid as an American now is that we have replaced Japan as the kind of uniting force. So that if I were a Chinese, I would not be so worried about Japan unless they became completely independent from America and got the atomic bomb. So I would want them to stay allied with the United States. But I think if I were a leader of China, I'd be more worried about the United States. And we have a very large army, and we have a lot of right-wing people now who are waving the flag of nationalism. And so I think that the pressure on Japan is likely to be less. I wish China had enough unity. They didn't have to rely on such pressure on patriotism. But given all the difficulties that they have of pulling the country together, there are probably a lot of leaders who would be tempted to still use anti-Americanism and so forth as a way to help unite the country.
Ezra, explain to me. I don't understand. You said that Mao Zedong says that thanks to Japan, China is united. Does it mean? Does it really mean that that helped the Communist Party win in the Civil War, which then, of course, united the country in that sense? It is really not united the country per se. It helped the communists, isn't it?
My understanding of Mao's comment at the time was not directed just to the communist victory over the nationalists. It was that nationalism had greatly strengthened and China was able to unite against that. And of course, it was under communist leadership. But I think as I understand, the basis for his saying that was not because of the Civil War, as it was that the country itself became more united. Yeah.
Any other? Charlie, you have a comment right here in front, and then Fred.
Thank you, Professor. Actually, my friend Rupa was right when he say Mao believed the Japanese invasion of China literally saved the Communist Party. In a sense, after Long March, there were literally only 15,000 troops went to Shanxi province from a Red Army point of view. And then the Nationalist Party had to deal with the Japanese invasion in that sense. So Mao was very truthful to that. But you wrote a terrific book about Deng Xiaoping. I was just wondering, have you ever visited the tracker repair factory that Deng spent 3.5 years in Jiangxi province?
I did.
And what was your impression of that? Yeah.
Well, it was a suburb of Nanchang, as you know. And they showed me the path that Deng Xiaoping used to walk in each day from his home to the place. In a way, one of my first impressions in thinking about that place was it was probably reminded him of the factories he worked in France in the 1920s. Because when he was in France in the early 1920s, he worked in a number of factories. And I think that, of course, this was a county machine repair station, and he worked there half a day. So I think that I'm not sure that had a huge impact on the way he thought about things. I think that was his daily work, and it was part of his activity. But what I do think about his experience when he went down to Jiangxi from 69 to 73 is it gave him time to think about what he would do when he would come back. And when I talked to David Gergen, who's a Harvard professor who spent a lot of time looking at presidents and leaders of countries, he said it's interesting that Charles de Gaulle and Churchill and Abraham Lincoln, a lot of people who wanted to make basic changes had a period in the wilderness before they came back to power. So they had a combination of experience in high place, then away from power for a few years, which gave them kind of a chance to develop new perspective. So I think the time I think Mao, treated Deng much nicer than he treated Liu Shaoqi. And I think he never quite gave up on Deng. And so I think he felt that Deng needed some experience. And actually Deng's, although he was isolated and not given a chance, he didn't live in too bad conditions when he went to that factory every day. So I think the main thing I would say about that is it gave him an opportunity to think about what he would do when he came back to power.
I'm in the wilderness too. Maybe one day I'll rise to greatness. I don't know. Fred?
Okay, thank you. So Ezra, I'm interested in your view whether the post-World War II experience of Germany and France in overcoming the bitter war memories and forging a strong Franco-German partnership that ultimately led to the creation of European Union holds any instructive lessons for contemporary China-Japan relationship, given the geography, economics, and the cultural affinity. There's no reason for China-Japan to remain stuck in the shadow of the recent past and not to looking forward, for a common interest and also for Asia Pacific overall. Because without Japan and China working together, there'll be no lasting peace and prosperity in this whole region. No, the U.S. military alliance or not. Okay, it's absolutely critical for China and Japan to find a way to work together as partners. So I'm just in that context. I wonder whether the France Germany experience hold any instructive lessons for us here managing.
I agree with your conclusion, but the situation was quite different because after the World War, France and Germany were immediately together, and they had to, in order to move ahead economically and develop modern industry, they had to begin cooperating in 1945, and they could begin to talk to each other. But in the case of Japan and China, from 1945 until 71, 72, they didn't, the United States did not really let them have that opportunity, and they could not play that kind of economic relations. So the progress between France and Germany stemmed, I think, from an economic base and the opportunity immediately after the war, the fact that it was absolutely necessary and urgently for them to begin talking together. And unfortunately, Japan and China missed that chance. So when they started having closer relations, 71, 72, it was already a different generation. So the people who, there had not been that urgency after 1945. So Japan never went through the period of apology and that France and Germany did at that time. So they missed that chance. But in my view, Japan should do a lot more to talk about World War II because it's so important to the Chinese. And I think that it's true, as Japanese say, that their leaders have apologized. But in my view, it's too perfunctory. It's too quick. They say we have caused much suffering in China during World War II. But in my view, what they ought to do in their high school textbooks, and they have government supervision over textbooks, is to require a much longer portion on the horrors of what they did in World War II. I think that's really necessary now in order to have better understanding between the two peoples. One quick thing I say is the Japanese haven't learned to say I'm sorry, and the Chinese have not learned to say thank you quite enough. Because the Japanese feel that in the 1980s and 90s, they really gave a lot of help to China, and that was in a way in lieu of reparations, and that the ordinary Chinese people don't recognize, may not even know about that. A small number occasionally say that. But I think if you were to say what would be needed to get a deeper popular understanding that would make it possible to achieve what Fred and I would both advocate. And I completely agree with Fred's analysis, how important that is. I think those two things could make a big difference. And I think that if they were to carry those two things out, it would make it much easier to have a broader, popular, deeper, basis for closer relations.
Last two questions, unless I have any other hands. If not, Kitamura-san, and this is gentleman, and then we'll take that as the last. How about that? Kitamura-san, former Consul General of Japan in Hong Kong with a Chinese wife.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Dr. And Vogel, for very informative lecture tonight. And I'm retired from foreign service. It's already 10 years. So I'm a free man and talking freely. try to be objective. But first, I love Hong Kong. And I hope that Hong Kong will continue to be very prosperous and the center of Asia as ever. I'm not teaching at school on Japan's foreign relations, foreign diplomacy. And I do echo with the previous question that the why, France and Germany, and why then China and Japan so struggling from the past. And the point is that national security. France and Germany shared the national security in the same framework, and China and Japan, we do not have such a framework, even conflicting. This is the point for the future. And the basic agenda for China and Japan, in my perspective, is how to reorganize the regional order in this region. And there are some factors. First, China is growing, will be even bigger in the future. Japan, in that sense, more or less stagnant. Second, China is more self-centered. Japan is less. So on the question of how to organize the regional order in this region, and Japan is ready to work together to make some standards, rules on security, on economic ties or whatever. China may say, I can do it. So here's a point. And I would like to see some regionalism, regional cooperation, a kind of framework where the two countries could work together. There are many agendas, environmental issues, economic ties, or others. So I do find a lot of opportunity for two countries to work together. And through such a process, there could be some regionalism or kind of a sense of working together, spirit of working together. And China is still expanding. China may not find it very much necessary. Japan needs it. So here's some, the gap of perception. But I think I'm more positive about the bilateral ties between China and Japan, and compared to 5-6 years before. So we'll see in the years to come, and the two countries, Japan and China, could find some common objective on bilateral issues, on regional issues, and that if China and Japan can work together for some regional targets on the goals, and it could be a good step and for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, if there are any regional security issues, then we cannot leave the United States out of this whole picture. So that will be something that also has to be, right, factor in.
I think for security issue, U.S. continues to be an important partner. And I think Japan, they find it the critical to maintain it, the alliance. But I think in the future, China may find having U.S. inside as a partner would be also made for China.
Well, I think China perhaps is originally quite open to having a relationship with the United States in a much more broad way, but the United States doesn't seem to want it, especially in the last few years. So that's another thought. But anyway, we better finish with the last two questions. The gentleman over here, and then the gentleman over there. Ezra, with your permission, I will ask them to ask the question first, and then you answer both questions as a concluding word, plus any other thought you have. If you don't, we'll remind you. Don't worry.
Okay,
Yes,
it's
sir.
a question just related to what you were discussing about the security treaty or alliance or China-Japan relations. Professor Vogel mentioned up to 1972, the U.S. was putting pressure on Japan not to get too close. But in the next few years, how far can Japan go out of step with the U.S. even if it wants to be closer with China?
Good question. The last one, please.
What do you have to say about Japan as number one looking back now, and perhaps the idea of China as number one looking forward?
So the first
U.S.
I'll answer the second one first.
Okay. You're the boss.
About Japan as number one. I have a lot of reporters from both China and Japan who ask me that question. And the usual implication is, Professor Vogel, you were quite wrong. It didn't turn out to be number one. The book became popular because of a misunderstanding of what I meant. I didn't mean in that book that Japan was the biggest economy. I meant that Japan was doing a lot of things very well. And when reporters come to me and say, now Japan has failed, I say, if you take as your only measure economic growth, okay. But if you take as your measure running a good society that's peaceful, clean, long-lived, good medical system, as a society that passed the rapid industrial growth and then concentrated on social issues of making a very successful society. You know, what country in the world has the longest lifespan? Japan. You know, what country has the best overall educational system for young people and a very low amount of inequality within the workforce and so forth. So I argue that Japan has done extremely well. Now the first question was, the
U.S. Right.
I think the Japanese now, after Xi Jinping's visit, will be sending a lot of diplomats to Washington to reassure them that they still love the United States and that they will still, be part of the alliance. I think that Japan is still nervous about China. And when China has a population 10 times Japan's and is now growing that fast, and the military is that strong, and the World War II movies can still be seen in China, I think the Japanese will remain quite nervous. And of course, they will try to be a porcupine, so that if China were to attack, it would be very costly. But I think they will want to keep the military alliance with the United States. So I think there are really quite firm ties between Japanese and American military. They have very good relationships with each other, training programs and so forth. So at least as far as I can see, for 10 or 20 years, I think that that's not really going to be an issue. Over the long haul, who knows whether the America will prove that reliable. But from what I know about the American military and their relations with Japan, I mean, we have problems in Okinawa. We have a lot of big issues. But in terms of exchanges between military, I think they're really very good relations, very good working ones. So I don't see any danger that separatism is going to grow, at least in the next decade or two.
What he's afraid is that America will again prevent Japan from having better relationship with China potentially, as perhaps they did right after World War II.
I don't think that would be true now. First of all, we don't have that power and leverage that we did when we were occupying Japan from 45 to 52. And, we were really the army of occupation in Japan. We don't have that kind of leverage. But secondly, I think that there are a lot of Americans who realize that an open trading system is necessary. And I think the amount of trade between China and Japan will not go up so rapidly that it will. I know there may be issues in certain technology. The Japanese were to supply certain kind of extremely high technology that could have military purposes, I think we would be very concerned. But except for that, I just don't see that America will have that interest or power to control Japanese contacts with China.
Ezra, I certainly hope that you are correct, but none of us should underestimate the foolishness of the United States of America. At least in the short run. In the longer run, America always does the right thing,
No.
as Abba Iban says, but only after exhausting all other alternatives. So let's all pray for the United States to do the right thing so that China and Japan can have much better relationship. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, we're delighted to have Professor Vogel with us. Thank you very much, Ezra.